Hey everyone, we're talking to David Lynch. These ethnic names, they're so troubling for me. David J. Lynch. Thankfully he's still at the Washington Post. They haven't fired him like they fired Karen Attiah. He's still there
Right.
for now, a global reporter. But he's joining me because he has this great new book out. I'm so glad he made time with me. It just came out last week. The book is called The World's Worst Bet: How the Globalization Gamble Went Wrong and What Would Make It Right. And specifically, the reason why I want to talk to him is because David takes a DeLorean from 90s, neoliberalism, Bill Clinton, global trade, everything will be awesome. And then things didn't go awesome. And furthermore, not only did things not go awesome, you see this type of economic populist argument being used and abused by the right, oftentimes hijacked by far right movements who've taken this grievance of workers, of laborers, infused it with anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-black sentiment, and voila, you have I call it the not the death march of white supremacy now in Europe, folks. The far right parties that were once fringe, and also in the United States. But there is also a way out of here, in my opinion. I'm just really curious to talk to David about this, of a type of economic populism that could actually, uplift the workers and maybe correct the wrongs that happened. So, David, congrats on the book. David told me, how should I promote the book? David said, listen, you just have to say that after the Quran and the Bible and The Hobbit in 1984, that the greatest, most gentle, most warm, most kind, most amazingest book I've ever read is The World's Worst Bet, written by David, that came out last week. He's very humble. But David, let's take this DeLorean back to the glorious 90s. Bill Clinton, our first black president, he had the shades on and he was playing the sax on Arsenio. And oh boy, we're going to open up trade. And I heard about neoliberal politics and everything was going to be a great again. Talk to us about the 90s. Take this DeLorean back, David.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, look, I have fond memories of the '90s. My hair was a darker shade of brown. My knees didn't hurt. Yeah. So you can sympathize. Uh, so there was a lot to recommend it, and certainly the mood and the atmosphere of the time was, I think, both among policymakers and the populace, was quite optimistic. And why not? If you put yourself back in that era and think of what people had lived through, it was really a quite extraordinary time. I grew up in the Cold War. I grew up with the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and NATO, and nobody, even into the mid '80s, was giving any thought to that going away anytime soon. And then all of a sudden, the Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union itself goes poof, and on Christmas Day, no less. A couple of years later, there's a democratic uprising in China. It's put down, but certainly it seems at the time that, well, China certainly will be the next domino to fall at some point. And so if you're in that climate, and the U.S. at the time has no real peer strategic rival, the economy is cranking along. By the end of the '90s, the stock market's going gangbusters. Economic growth is high, unemployment's low. What's not to like? And so, from that vantage point, looking out into the future, policymakers were telling themselves and were telling voters that globalization and further trade liberalization was going to deliver not just widespread shared prosperity here at home, but was going to lead to a more harmonious international environment, as our former authoritarian adversaries in the former Soviet Union and in China would inevitably open up their political systems and join a U.S. led international system. And so then, if you look at the world we're in today, this is not the destination that they had in mind.
Yeah, 30 years later, this is not what happened. And in the book, you're talking about, it was Clinton's fantastic failure in a sense that, at the time, hey, when Clinton left office, I remember, even despite the Monica Lewinsky scandal, he still had high ratings because the economy was good. And people are like, all right, he has his moral failings and ends up sleeping with literally anyone he can find. But He's a smart guy. The economy is much better now than it was during the time of Reagan and Bush. Republicans had 12 years, the 80s to 92. That was disastrous, right? Labor got decimated. Income inequality increased. And all right, with this neoliberal politics, it seems like we're much better off. Where did the cracks start showing?
Well, I think of Clinton as sort of the godfather of U.S. style globalization because, to my mind, he fully understood what was happening in the global economy, and he could articulate the unavoidable nature of much of this change in a way that few politicians have been able to. And so I think he understood, and he talked about the fact that, look, globalization, as he would say, is a fact, not a choice. And it's going to make us all better off collectively. It's going to effectively spread benefits across the whole economy like frosting on a cake. But there are going to be winners and losers. And well-educated folks in the cities and on the coasts, at the margin, they're going to do really well. But if you're a relatively uneducated basic factory worker with the fewest skills, and you're in a factory in Northwest Tennessee or something, you're probably going to be in trouble. But that's okay because the winners are going to do so well that they can share some of their gains with the quote unquote losers, and we'll all move forward together. And that was a great theory. And the problem was that second part, the winners sharing the gains, that never really happened.
The
And
winner takes all, David. The winner takes all.
yep, yep. So, there was a lot of talk about it, and as a matter of fact, there was one speech that I think is it reads as such an aha moment. Clinton's last speech as president at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he talks along these lines, and he says, and he's pointing to the fact that the budget by that point, the federal budget had been balanced for a couple of years in a row. The economic climate was great, and he said, "Look, if we can't take care of our people now, we're never going to be able to."
Mm.
And he was exactly right. We never were able to.
You interviewed Clinton for this book,
Yep.
and of course, no one has a crystal ball as whenever. Uh, uh, but there's weaknesses. Look, so you give. I'll try to be fair, because I try to be fair, but I'm also critical. Is at the time they're like, okay, this will happen. And at the time, there was short-term growth, and there was NAFTA, and there was global trade, right? And hey, look, everyone's winning, and America's winning. Okay, wonderful. But there's a fallacies that are built in, caked to the system, and I think you're seeing this right now, right? Where even with Democrats, you're seeing this deep resistance, David, to embracing the type of economic populism or that kind of bold progressive economic change that came in during a moment of crisis, say FDR, right? You're seeing that, regardless of what you think of Mamdani's politics, nonetheless a winning message, still not embracing it, right? Regardless of what you think of AOC and Bernie Sanders, and the fact that all these folks, independents, Latinos, young people, even Trump voters, like, yes, go against the establishment, tax the billionaires, right? You still see the Democratic establishment say, no, 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 let's just go back to the 90s style way of doing things. Things will be great then. Um, Bill Clinton is a smart guy. You interviewed him,
Yep.
and now he's at this stage of his life where he can look back. What was his audit, if you will, his self audit?
Forgiving, but thoughtful, I think. I put it to him that this was really the core failure, this failure to address the distributional consequences of globalization, this failure to sort out the winners and losers issue. That was really our core failure. And he said, I agree with that. Now, the lens through which he looked at that is, he said, effectively, the private sector kind of outfoxed the public sector. And what he meant was, as private capital became more mobile over this period of time, as the barriers to finance moving across borders fell down, it became easier for corporations and individuals with lots of money to move it away from the tax man's reach. So the public sector was, in his description, poorly equipped and proved unable to sort of keep pace with those private sector trends. As I look at what happened across multiple administrations, and I do think this is not just a Clinton story. As a matter of fact, most of the era that I talk about follows
Yeah,
uh, his
absolutely.
his period in the White House. But it was always the case that there was at least one other priority that took precedence over the needs of disadvantaged workers and more broadly over the sort of worst case thinking that I go through all the time. I mean, I'm a pessimist about life, so I'm constantly engaged in worst case analysis. You know, those people who say, "Is the glass half full or is it half empty?" I'm the guy who says, "What glass? I don't even see a
I
glass.
see shards.
I see shards of glass, and I think I just cut myself." Um, but we engaged in almost no worst case analysis. In other words, we built these global supply chains optimized for low cost and efficiency above all else. And they were optimized for a world where no natural disasters ever occurred, where no geopolitical conflicts ever occurred, where a country that had key deposits of minerals that you needed for just about every piece of your modern economy, that country would never turn out to be your main strategic rival. And so it was a lot of, sort of best case theorizing, I think. And as I say, there was always another priority. So we had to balance the budget. That took precedence over. There was a fetish for balancing the budget in the
Yep.
late 90s. There's no reason we couldn't have gotten by on, say, a 1% of GDP budget deficit. At the moment, we're at about 6. If we were at 1%, that's terrifically fiscally responsible and would still have freed up billions of dollars that could have been devoted to these social needs had we been willing to fight those battles. And then under Bush, of course, there was more of an ideological aversion to this kind of measure. And there were the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a desire for better relations with a rising China to address emerging nuclear power in North Korea. So it was always something else. And I think the feeling grew up over time. And I should say, I was sort of part of the conventional wisdom of that era. So I'm not criticizing anybody that I wouldn't make the same criticism of myself. But I think these sort of chronic concerns felt like the sort of chronic concerns that, well, we can always, yeah, we'll get to that later, or maybe we'll never get to it, but it's not that big a deal.
Yep.
And I think what we've learned is allowing those chronic concerns and the shortcomings in the response to globalization to simmer and to metastasize over time, produce far bigger political problems that we're dealing with today.
No, I agree. It's like the inshallah, kick the can down the road. Inshallah, it'll be fine, right? And I think there's these underlying, regardless if you're Republican or Democrat, these assumptions, these flawed, fatal assumptions that have unfortunately hurt not just the Democrats in our political discourse, but also the economy and workers, right? The fact that okay, help the rich. Whatever you do, make the rich richer. And you know what? The rich, they'll spread the wealth. Even though throughout history, never, ever, ever have the rich, after they've gotten money, David, spread the wealth. I remember Charles Barkley randomly, it was the first Trump administration. And just certain things that stick in your mind. I was watching basketball, and it was the first tax cuts. And I remember he was just talking about NBA. They were talking about it. He goes, thanks, Donald Trump, for the tax cuts. Sorry for poor people. Sorry, black people. I'm going to go buy more jewelry. And I'm like, I appreciate that, right? And there's something that you always want to make sure that the rich are rich, the wealthy get theirs, and inshallah, it'll trickle down. So this was like, for me, democratic trickle down politics. But trickle down never works. We've seen it for 40 years. Nothing ever trickles down, number one. Number two, I also think it's interesting that they assumed that this will, it's to me, it's the new abundance. It's like abundance is like a type of revamped neoliberalism. There is enough to go around. Don't worry, the sky isn't falling. And inshallah, just trust the system and make minor tweaks to it. Don't engage in bold reform because that's too radical. And inshallah, the wealth will be there and it will be abundant and it will flow. David, am I wrong? Am I crazy to see that maybe, just maybe, oh, I don't know, just spinning the same wheel will lead to the same results? I'm a simple English major. You tell me.
Well, I'm a simple government major, so I'm not sure I'll be much help. Uh, but I think there's plenty of blame to go around for this. I think this failure to address the distributional costs if you look at it through this program called Trade Adjustment Assistance, which was always the main social program designed to help workers who lost their jobs because of import competition, because of trade policy. Started in 1962 by John F. Kennedy. Why did he start it? He needed a political chit to win congressional support for a trade law he was trying to get through, and that was a good foreshadowing of what this program, its main purpose would be throughout history, because it's always the thing that the politicians can point to and say to the workers, well, you'll get assistance under this program. TAA will even bump up the budget for a year or two, and that'll sort of smooth the path of the next trade bill we want to get through. But in reality, the program was always uh, incredibly inadequate. It was never provided with enough money in its initial phases. It didn't include services workers. Then, when under the Obama administration, they did expand it to include services workers. It was time limited to only 2 years. So all the corporations that would benefit from provisions, and this was attached to the South Korean Free Trade Agreement in 2009, I think it was. All the corporations that would benefit from provisions in that agreement would get those benefits indefinitely, forever. But the workers who needed help transitioning into new careers, well, they were on the clock. 2 years, and then you're done. But I should say this was, corporations didn't like paying for it. Republicans certainly didn't want to spend the money on it. Democrats were not terribly enthusiastic often. The labor movement was regarded TAA as quote unquote burial insurance. And there were labor leaders who said, look, I don't, it does nothing for me as the leader of, XYZ union to help my members transition into another line of work. I need
That's right.
members. I'm not in the business of getting them jobs in some other industry that may be under a different union or may have no union at all. So I want to hang on to those members. So everybody has a little bit of blame, in my eyes, for the way we failed to really respond to the force of globalization.
No, I think we're still seeing the failure right now, and I agree with you. Right? It wasn't. I think it's hypercharged with the Republicans and those type of just cruel policies with the gutting of labor, during Reaganomics and deregulation. But I think it is important, and I appreciate what your book and what you're saying is that also the Democrats came along and with the best of intentions. I don't know if it's the best of intentions. They thought, okay, this will be great for everyone, and by everyone we mean really the upper class and the wealthy. And as far as the workers, inshallah it'll be better. Just trust us. If things go as according to plan, the workers will actually be better off. And that didn't happen. Can you talk to us? And just, what's common to you isn't common to everyone. So this goes in place. You got NAFTA, neoliberalism, global trade. People are happy in the short run. America's doing fantastic. Okay, America's at number one at the top. China is a competitor, but not really. People are moving towards, center-left politics, democracy. Okay, then war on terror happens. That's terrible, but still, we still have these global economic trade. We have cheap jeans. You can go to Old Navy and buy a jean for like $2. Americans are like, I can buy. We can outsource. Corporations like, this is awesome. We can pay a Pakistani like $3 a month to make like 500 shirts. This is awesome. What was the actual impact on workers, both at home and abroad?
Sure. Good question, and I think it is important to look at this because there is a positive side of the ledger, and I don't think it should be lost. So, um, the good news, so to speak, from globalization was 1.5 billion people, almost all of them in the developing world, many of them in China, lifted out of the worst sort of crushing poverty over this period of time, thanks to greater global trade and integration. For us in advanced economies like the U.S., we all benefited, or most of us benefited from a better mix of jobs in the economy, wider availability of products on the shelves. increase in purchasing power of, according to one study, of by 2007, about $1,500 per household, thanks to cheaper goods from China and elsewhere, and almost non-existent inflation for about 15 years until we reached the pandemic. So all those things are good. I mean, I remember, this is a small point, but I remember as a kid, roughly 100 years ago, growing up in Connecticut. And, we could have fresh uh, vegetables like corn on the cob for about 6 weeks every summer. And then we were back to canned fruit cocktail for the rest of the year. Uh, Now, if you want corn on the cob in the middle of February, you can get it thanks to trade with places like Mexico. That's a small example, but there are real benefits, and there were real benefits in the developing world. Look how prosperous China has become over this period of time. But the costs were, to go back to these distributional concerns, if the benefits were spread across the whole economy, the costs were like economic tumors in specific communities, manufacturing dependent communities, and among specific cohorts of people, the least educated and those with the fewest skills. And those people really paid the price for all of us to enjoy these wider benefits. And then that process is known now, economists call it as the China shock. China's economic rise floods our market with lots of inexpensive products. That's great for you and me as consumers. But if you're a guy at a tire factory in northwestern Tennessee and you lose your job in part because low-cost Chinese tires are now taking over the market, you don't see it the same way I do. And many of those same people, first, they get no help from the government. And then, second, a few years later, they get hit by the global financial crisis in 2008.
Yep.
That's made
We're going to
worse.
talk about that, but continue. Yes.
Yep. That's made worse by our failure to properly monitor and regulate global capital flows. So that bubble gets bigger than it otherwise would have gotten, and the bust is thus more painful. And so I think of those folks, they get hit by the China shock, then they riding into the global financial crisis, still wounded from that China shock experience. They get smacked again. Again, they feel themselves abandoned by their government. They look at the bankers they blame for the crisis, and they say, geez, those guys are getting all the help in the world. I'm getting foreclosed on. My wife just lost her job. And it's not terribly long after that period of time that you start to see the rise of Donald Trump.
Before we get to the rise of Donald Trump, I want to stick there for a second because the China shock, as some people notice, is other countries would take advantage of U.S. capitalism and our policies. They're like, all right, fantastic. We'll pay our workers like less than minimum wage. We'll have shitty conditions, but nonetheless, like you said, because things are so unbalanced, at least they're getting some wage. And you all, U.S. consumers, are perfectly fine with our human rights abuses and us, giving our workers some money as opposed to no money, and they're thus able to produce all this stuff that you want to buy for a cheap price. And guess what? U.S. consumers said, A-OK, and U.S. corporations said, hey, why pay a living wage to a worker here in America when I can go to Bangladesh and China and Pakistan? So I'll move my factories over there, right, to have a lower cost. So now we're going to just weed out our whole manufacturing in the U.S. because, it's for corporations. They're like, why should I pay a guy $12 when I can pay a Bangladeshi kid $3? And then, hey, everything works out. And so people are in pain. The workers are getting hollowed out. We are also benefiting, folks. We're just trying to keep it real here. We're all connected. And as this is happening, because I was old enough to remember, things were going great. Things were going great. Things were going great. And the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. I was a young man. I lived through it. These rich people found a way to sell these shitty mortgages wrapped up with a good rating, even though they were crap. Short-term money, bubble eventually burst. The middle class just got destroyed. People lost their homes. The rich got bailed out, and then Obama comes in. He's a Democrat, and instead of engaging in massive reform, we were told they're too big to fail. You gotta bail them out. And so here we bailed out. For those who don't remember, bailed out these financial institutions, who many people, David, saw as the architects of our pain, and the people who didn't get bailed out were the American workers. Talk to us, and if you disagree with me, Go jump right in and disagree with me. Talk to us about 2007, 2008.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. I think it's important to say that the primary cause of the global financial crisis, or the primary causes, were domestic. So it's not that globalization
Right, right.
caused 2008, but it is a fact that the enormous amounts of capital flooding into our country, which, and I want to try and keep this as straightforward as I can, which are the flip side of our unbalanced trade relationship. And one begets another. Because we buy so much more stuff from overseas than we sell, folks overseas, particularly in China, end up with a lot of dollars that they've got to do something with. And by and large, the Chinese invest those in our treasury securities. Now, that's good news. That kept borrowing costs here lower than they otherwise would have been. So that sounds like good news. That's good for the economy. But it also indirectly encouraged the banks to keep producing more and more of these mortgage-backed securities, which were at the root of the housing bubble and bust. And so by continuing to run that engine, even after you could sort of hear it was about to throw a flywheel or drop a wrench or something, it wasn't healthy, but it kept the engine going anyway. That made the housing bubble bigger than it would have been otherwise, and thus made the collateral damage once it burst worse than it otherwise would have been.
And so now we're in 2008, 2009, and as we're recovering, and that was tough, folks. I lived through it as well. It was really tough for the young bucks who don't remember. I mean, I'm talking about that was one of the worst economic recessions since the Great Depression. I mean, entire industries were just mauled. You had housing crises in California, Nevada, Florida. People who made money all of a sudden lost their money, right? It was a shock. With this shock comes the shock, the cultural shock of a black president, a black Muslim president. He's not Muslim. I'm just kidding, right? And then with this, but with this economic shock comes also the emergence of a black man named Barack Hussein Obama. And folks, things were so bad in this country. Things were so bad that people are like, you know what? Let's give this guy Barack Obama a chance. You know, everyone who thinks that Barack Obama signaled, you know, a new type of America where we would look beyond color. I always tell people, hey, things were so bad and George W. Bush effed up so bad that the pendulum for much of America shifted and it said,
What
let's give it to this quasi-Muslim
Did
instead.
I have a memory of the Onion. I think it was the Onion having a headline something like black man gets nation's worst job when Obama became president. That, as you say, things were so bad, we're going to give this terrible job of cleaning it up to
That's literally
the
what
poor
happened.
black
And
guy.
so here comes Obama. Regardless of what you all think about Obama, nonetheless, oftentimes with Democrats, they inherit, like you said, the worst economy, and try to make it a bit better, which they did. But Obama is a black man, and I remember when Obama was elected, he had to prove that he was an American citizen. And the person who promoted the racist and Islamophobic birther conspiracy was Donald Trump. And I'm connecting this together because with the election of Barack Obama, you also got the emergence of the Tea Party. And you also got, if you will, a steroid injection in these far right groups who are able to prey upon the economic discontent of global trade and neoliberalism, but also inject it with good old fashioned racism. David.
Yeah, well, there's no question that the financial crisis provoked a backlash on the left and the right. You remember we had the Occupy Wall Street on the left, Tea
Absolutely.
Party on the right, and at one point, I remember Obama. I think this was in 2011 or 2012. I don't entirely remember. He went out to Kansas and gave a speech that sort of borrowed some of the Occupy Wall Street rhetoric and thinking. But the real action or impact of the response to the crisis was on the right. And how do I mean that? The Tea Party really promoted the idea of austerity economics all of a sudden. And what that meant was at a time when we needed the government to be doing what we did during the pandemic. We give Biden credit for this. His experience in the Obama administration, he learned the lesson that when you do have an economic downturn, you do need to respond with Keynesian measures and have the government step in to do what the private sector for the moment can't do. And that's why we had such a strong recovery coming out of the pandemic, and we had the weakest post-war recovery since World War II in the wake of the financial crisis. And during that period, we had 6 straight years where, because of the Tea Party influence on the congressional Republicans, we ended up shrinking the government's contribution to the economy, shrinking the budget deficit as a share of GDP. And to put that in layman's language, what did that mean? What that meant was, at a time when we needed the government to be helping us all carry the economic load, the government instead was standing in front of us saying, no, stop, slow down, don't move forward. You've got to go slower. And it was in hindsight, probably the worst thing we could have done. It explained why that recovery was so anemic, which, again, if you're in those communities that in the early part of the first years of the 21st century, you get hammered by the China shock. Then you get hammered again a few years later by the financial crisis. Then you get several years of the weakest recovery since World War II. Well, by 2015, 2016, you're ready to take a flyer on somebody who comes in and says, the establishment has failed you and only I can fix it. I'm the only guy who knows how. And I'm saying a lot of things that nobody else will say because I'm politically incorrect and I'm not bound by any of the normal ways of doing things. And I think the coupling both the economic trade related discontent with the immigration concerns at the time, which certainly had a racial dimension to them. That's, to my way of thinking, a good bit of the answer of how did we get here.
And in 2016, if you all remember, Donald Trump, exactly what David said, he goes, I'm anti-establishment. I'm the bulldozer. I'm the guy who, hell, I don't pay my taxes because I know the system's rigged. And look, I have the art of the deal. I'll make you all money. It was all bullshit, but the bullshit sold. And also the main reason, not the only reason, was cultural anxiety. So we had cultural anxiety plus economic anxiety plus a mistrust of the establishment and people who were so shattered and didn't give a shit about the institution anyway and said, these guys haven't helped us. All right, let's take a flyer, like you said, on Donald Trump.
Yep.
Now, on the opposite side, you had Bernie Sanders, another outsider, who was saying the establishment is rigged. It's the oligarchy. It's the billionaires. They keep screwing the workers. We actually have to reform the system so that we can make America affordable again, tax the rich, pay the rich, regulate, help workers, right? And a lot of people were also taking a flyer on him. It just so happens Trump barely won. Now, Trump wins, and he also does a bullshit type of Jedi mind trick on people that once he got in, he actually did what? He actually helped the rich. And he went back to the trickle down. Can you talk to us about Trump's first term economic policy?
Sure. Well, one huge contradiction between his policies, and that's why I think a lot of Trump's appeal is sort of cultural and atmospheric and personality based more than a fine parsing of uh, economic theory and practice. But his central plank of his trade policy is aimed at shrinking the trade deficit. In other words, getting the U.S. to sell as much abroad as we buy from abroad. Now, we can discuss whether that really is a concern, but it's certainly it's the kind of metric that to the average guy sounds like a problem. Oh, it's a deficit. So it's a shortfall. That's got to be bad, right? A shortfall has got to be a bad thing. He's going to close it. He's blaming those wily foreigners who have somehow taken advantage for decades of the richest, most powerful country on the planet. Our leaders have been stupid for decades until 2016 and taken advantage of us. And so we've got to close that deficit. Well, then one of the first things he does is put through a massive tax cut, which is only going to make the trade deficit worse because it's putting money in the hands of affluent people middle class people as well, and they're going to go out and spend that money. Much of it's going to be spent on foreign products, so the trade deficit is going to go up, and that is, in fact, what we saw happen. But I don't think the average guy doesn't, and this is one of the shortcomings, I think, of the traditional approach or the traditional um, advocates of globalization is they treat these issues like we're in an economics seminar at Yale, and we all get credit if we get the right answer. And this is about political power. This is
Mm.
about politics. This is about wooing people. This is about charming people. This is about getting people on your side. And there's a dimension to that. And, great Democratic politicians have understood that in the past. There's an element of that that's charisma and emotional and, not simply adding up an equation or running a regression and getting the proper answer. And I say in the book, if you're somebody who favors more trade liberalization, it's incumbent on you to find a good political answer to the shortcomings of the approach that we've run for the last 30 years. Because just hoping, as many of these traditionalists hope, that we're somehow going to find ourselves back in the world of 2015, those days are gone. It's not going to happen. We're in a new environment, and there's got to be a new argument.
Yeah, exactly. It's a new environment where you need an argument. And, regardless of what you think about him, I think the message of Zoran Mamdani and others, which is really catching fire, is we need to make America affordable again. We're getting screwed by the rich. The oligarchy is taking all of our milkshakes. I don't think there should be billionaires, but I'll work with them. Let me throw out some crazy ideas. Free buses. Why not? And Americans are like, how dare you say that? And everyone else in Europe is like, we have free colleges. Why are you guys upset at that? It's like, you guys find money for wars. You give taxes to the rich. It's almost like we're in a Stockholm syndrome. We're like, we will pay taxes and we cannot have good things and the rich should get richer. And how dare this elected official come in and just try to give me free buses, right? But people are resonating with it, right? A lot of people who voted for Trump voted for AOC. A lot of people who voted for Trump are going for Mamdani. And you're seeing just 8 months in, a lot of the Latinos who voted for Trump to make their lives better, they've all fled to 2016 numbers, and young people have fled because they're like, all right, I thought you would be, again, you'd be the bulldozer, but you seem to be making money for you and your crypto friends. I want someone to fight for me and fight for something. And we've seen now that neoliberal trend from the 90s that's come forth for the past 30 years. And I'm sure you've seen all the polls with young people. They're like, you want me to be a capitalist? What has capitalism done for me? You want me to be a Democrat? What has Democrat done for me? You want me to be a Republican? What has it done for me? All right. You say socialism is a scary word. I don't care. Let's give a shot to this democratic socialist. And what I see right now, David, is people just don't care about these labels anymore. They just want anyone who can promise them reform that will make their life affordable. And they see rich people getting richer and they have no future.
Yeah, a couple of things that I want to say to that. First, I do think, I think all the time. I've got three boys. They're all in their 20s, and the youngest was born in 2000. And when I think of the first 25 years of his life compared to the first 25 of my life, I was born in 1959. And for those, I grew up at a time when it was very easy to say and believe with a straight face that this was the greatest country in the world. And things, certainly from the perspective of a child and then a teenager and slowly aging, things always seem to be getting better. We had problems, but then we had a civil rights revolution, and then women were getting more rights with the rise of feminism, and then gay people started getting rights, and the economy was doing better, and the good guys won in Watergate, and we got out of Vietnam, and so, you know, from a simple perspective, it seemed like this is a great place and things are always getting better. And then I think about the first 25 years of my youngest son's life, and it's
Mm.
been 9/11, our response to 9/11, which sent us into Iraq and Afghanistan, a housing bubble, and then the worst economic crisis since the 1930s, and then a global pandemic and a flawed response to it, the rise of populism, an attempted insurrection, a president who tries to stay in office after he's lost an election. That's not a great 25 years,
Nope.
um, first of all. Now, to your point on policy, what I say in the book is, to my mind, both political parties have identified a problem that they probably can't fix, which is a decline in manufacturing jobs, which we've seen in every advanced economy and which we're seeing in China. Just as we went from everybody was working on the farm 100 years ago, and then they went into factories. The 1950s, 1 out of every 3 Americans worked in a factory. Thanks to automation, we're now down to 1 in 12. Automation and some trade policies, as I describe in the book. But automation, you can't get away from.
Yeah,
And
AI is here. It's not going away, and they've
it's not,
fully embraced it.
that's right. And but both parties, either with industrial policy or tariffs, are trying to bring back those lost manufacturing jobs. I think it's spitting into the wind.
Yep.
What I say in the book is, look, the China shock is in the past. It ended maybe 15 years ago at this point, the bulk of it. But that's not going to be the last economic shock that American workers are going to face. And AI is the best example of that. And yet, our safety net, our system for helping workers acclimate themselves to changing circumstances is just as flimsy today as it was when China came on the scene. So why not experiment with some more active labor market policies? Why not look into wage insurance? Why not consider place-based strategies? We've frankly tried just about everything else. And this to me could be the missing link. And even though politically it would be a heavy lift, you'd need to raise tax revenue. There are obvious loopholes that if you had determination to address, you might be able to tackle.
Yeah, why not? Oh, tax the rich. Why not actually, close the loopholes that allow them to avoid paying their taxes? Why not? Oh, I don't know. With the tax money that we have, invest in resources that let people feel like they can have kids, right? Paid parental leave, right? We're the only major industrialized country that does not have federal parental leave, right? It's up to the basically your employer if they're kind enough to give you paid parental leave. Even Afghanistan has paid parental leave, folks. Life expectancy in America has gone down 3 years. People cannot do not. There's no middle class is being hollowed out for the first time ever. The top 1% have more wealth. David knows this, but for those who don't know, than the entire middle class. And it's so interesting that David, this is one of those things where you and I can show our age, and I had to update my software. When you and I were growing up, we used to, we were told there's only two things guaranteed in life: death and taxes. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was giving a talk to some young folks, and I was like, there's only two things guaranteed in life: death and taxes. And they just kept looking at me. They're like, "What, rich people don't pay taxes?" So I'm like, you're right. The only thing guaranteed in life is death. And Elon Musk and everyone else are trying their best to make sure that they live forever. I'm not making that up. So, Dave, it's bold economic reform. What we need, to me, it seems like, and you mentioned it, not just bold economic reform, but a person who's willing, with personality and charisma and storytelling, to imagine for people a better future, right? A type of a new deal for a new generation that is hemorrhaging, right? And that type of boldness, when everyone seems to bring it out, whether it's on the right or the left, it seems to me that they get crushed. They get crushed. And I think you're seeing it right now, regardless of what you think of Zoran Mamdani's politics. This guy, he's winning over people, all right? People like listening to him. They're like, I like what he's selling. And yet you had the Democrats literally unleash Bill Clinton, Clyburn, Larry Summers, New York Times, Bill Ackman, to crush this guy. And still to this day, Hakeem Jeffries and Senator Schumer have not embraced him. To which I see is they are desperately holding on to this type of old school hope of a type of reform neoliberal politics that if they just get in power one more time, this time, David, this time, it'll work.
Well, I think what I try to spend most of my time on in the book, rather than advocate policies, because I'm really a newsman more than an advocate, is point out that before we can figure out how to go forward, we have to figure out where we've come from and what mistakes we've made along the path. And I think it's important to learn the lessons of the last 30 years if we want to get the challenges of the next 30 addressed in the proper way. And as far as Mamdani's appeal, I think there's a long tradition of politicians who look like they're enjoying the work. People would rather talk to somebody who looks happy and positive and upbeat. I think it was Hubert Humphrey, I'll show my age, who was called the Happy Warrior. And he was, he was a strong figure in favor of civil rights in the 1940s at a time when it wasn't popular in the Democratic Party, and was a pretty upbeat, ebullient figure throughout his career. I think people, would rather deal with that kind of politician than somebody who looks like he's just emerged from a colonoscopy.
Can you tell me what would you say? And again, just being as a student of economic history, if moving forward, three things that we should not repeat.
That's good. That's a good question. Um, I would I would say first is we shouldn't uh, make sales pitches for policies that we don't really believe or intend to carry out.
Hmm.
So one detail at when when we were passing legislation in 2000 that was part of China's joining of the World Trade Organization. So this is when China formally becomes part of the global trading system, which was a big deal. And part of as you would imagine, there were some worries about, well, what's that going to mean for factory workers in the United States? And the Clinton administration said, not to worry. We've negotiated a provision in the terms of their joining that will allow us to put what are called safeguard tariffs on China if too many goods come in too fast. So don't worry, factory workers, you're protected. Then the flood of imports starts really under Bush. And the Bush administration looks at it and says, well, now, if you put those tariffs on, it's just going to make things more expensive for American consumers. And we won't buy the stuff from China, but we'll buy it from the Philippines or Vietnam anyway. It's still not going to be made here. So there's really no point. Well, to my mind, you can't have it both ways. You can't tell people at the time you're trying to convince them to go ahead with something, don't worry, you're protected by this particular measure. And then when the bad times come, say, oh, that thing I told you would protect you. Oh, no, that's a waste of time. We can't use that. Um, and we saw that repeated in the whole winners and losers thing. If you don't actually plan to do something, don't tell voters you're going to do it. It just breeds cynicism and resentment.
Folks, there's nearly 1,000 people joining us for what I thought would be a super wonky conversation that no one would turn into, but you all did. And I'm talking to David Lynch. He has a book that came out that is the greatest, most wonderful, most amazing book of all time, The World's Worst
You have
Bet.
to ask him.
Yeah, how the globalization gamble went wrong and what would make it right. And he takes a DeLorean from the 90s to the current moment, and he just tracks it, and he says, like, this is what happened. Yeah, sure, we got global trade and we got NAFTA and the rich got a bit richer, but there was a cost to it and the hollowing out of certain industries and those workers, both here and abroad, who got left behind, and other individuals, both on the right, both here and abroad, have been capitalizing on that rage and that anger, and of course, with the America First and Europe First movement, and infused it with a type of racism and anti immigrant sentiment, which in part has led to the rise of Donald Trump and these right wing movements abroad. And if he writes a sequel, that should be your sequel, doing the deep dive, and how nonetheless the rich have gone richer, nothing trickled down, and he gives his opinions on what would make it right. And I believe we need that type of bold economic reform and these bold ideas, because if you look at all the data right now, it's bipartisan. It doesn't matter. People don't have fidelity to the Democrats anymore, to Republicans. They don't care about democratic socialism. They don't care about capitalism. They're like, what will make my life better? How can I afford a type of future that my daddy and my granddaddy had? And in America, folks, the numbers are really disturbing. Our life expectancy has gone down. Faith in America and America's future has gone down. When it comes to young people, oh my gosh, if you look at the trends and the data of young people, such as my kids and David's kids who were born this century, they don't have faith in the American economy, the American dream. So we need something to be bold and something different, and we need you to be informed. And that's what David did. There's 1,000 people watching, David. Well done for a nerdy, wonky conversation. Usually when we talk about current affairs and politics on this show, we get 2,000, 2,500, which is a lot. But to get 1,000 for this is great. And I know some people joined us late. strongly recommend listening to the entire conversation where David connects the dots. We take the DeLorean from the 90s all the way up to 2025. This will be up on my Substack later today. The Substack is free. It'll be with a transcript. So for those who joined us late, David, shamelessly promote yourself.
Well, shamelessly promote the book, The World's Worst Bet, which I enjoyed working on over the past 3 years or so. And can't believe it's finally out. It does tell the story of the epic transformation of the U.S. and global economies over the last 30 years, how we got from the so-called end of history when everybody expected happy days were here again to the rise of economic nationalism and populism and Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. We've ended up, as I think I said earlier, we've ended up in a very different place from where we expected to be.
Yeah, unfortunately, folks, unfortunately. And also in the book, David actually gets an interview with Bill Clinton, who reflects on his role in this, where he thought it was going and where it went. So, folks, I'll be back in about 15 minutes with Danielle Moody because I should rest, but who needs rest while the world is ending, right? So, um, we try our best. David still has a job at the Washington Post so far.
So far,
Inshallah.
so far, so good.
Yeah, so but we don't know. So buy the book. So just in case he has insurance and gets enough money to write a sequel. This has been The Left Hook. There are no paywalls here because Dave, I'm a terrible capitalist. If you have some money, go buy David's book. If you have a few dollars left over, then become a paid subscriber. Be kind to each other. Be informed. And please, oh please, don't be a fascist. David, thanks so much. Come back anytime.
Thanks a million. I enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye bye.